So I have to make a confession. I asked Bailey to sing that a month ago, and then I forgot about it. So when she launched into that, I thought, well, I'm glad she picked that one. Then I thought, well, wait a minute, I think I asked her to do that. So I'm glad that she remembered, even though I forgot. Hey, if you have your Bible, I want you to turn to John 20. And while you're turning there, I want to ask you a question. Can you imagine what it would be like to find out that somebody that you deeply loved, that you thought was dead, was actually alive? Or how about this? Can you imagine the shock of discovering that someone whose ashes you had already spread was in fact alive? That's what happened to the family of a 23-year-old man named Tyler Chase. The February 7th headline in the New York Times said this: ashes were given to his family, but he wasn't dead. The article tells the story of this guy that you see on the screen. He had been living in a rehab facility, an addiction recovery facility, for 6 months when an unidentified body was found that had a temporary driver's license in the back pocket of the jeans the guy was wearing that said that the unidentified body, was Tyler Chase of Portland, Oregon. That was all they needed at the Multnomah County Medical Examiner's Office to make a positive identification. They then issued a death certificate, notified his family, cremated the ashes, and had them shipped to this guy's grieving family. 6 months later, that was in February, 6 months later, in October, Tyler Chase was released from the rehab facility. He went to the Department of Human Services to update his information and enroll in some assistance programs. And when he sat down across the desk from the lady that was taking his information, she put in his Social Security number and immediately received an alert that the man that was now sitting across from her was dead, at least according to the state of Oregon. It took them several hours to unravel what had happened. As best they can figure, somebody at the rehab facility stole his wallet, and then when they left, they took it with them, and it was in their pocket when they died. After they figured all that out, though, they then had to go notify his parents, and mom and dad, that he was actually still alive. And his mother was so overcome with emotion that she declined to talk to reporters. But he did have a cousin that said this to the New York Times. She said, "It is so hard to believe that something like this could even happen. It just makes no sense." For the last few weeks, we've been in this series in which we've been exploring the events, the decisions, and especially the conversations that took place during the last week of Jesus' life on earth. And as we pick up the story in John 20, it's important to understand that it appeared to everyone involved as if the story had come to a tragic and violent end. On Thursday night, his disciples and those closest to him had stood and watched as the temple police and the Roman soldiers stormed into the garden, took him into custody. As Thursday transitioned into Friday, they watched as he withstood one sham trial, complete with false witnesses after another, until finally on Friday morning they stood in the crowd and watched in horror as he was crucified, nailed to a cross. And they stood there all day until he took his final breath sometime around 3 p.m. afternoon. And for them, you have to understand, that was the end. That was like the last chapter of the book they thought they had been writing. All their hopes had come up empty. All their dreams for the future were now shattered. This little movement that they thought they were a part of was dissolving. And to make it even worse, their closest friend, the one they had abandoned everything to follow, was dead. As Friday transitioned into Saturday, it felt to all those early followers of Jesus as if everything in their world had been upended. There's a song that we sing sometimes that starts with the line, "Saturday was silent. Surely it was through." And that's the way they felt. For them, their hero was dead. The Romans had won. And it looked as if God had abandoned them. If you know the rest of the story, though, you know that after Jesus' body was removed from the cross, he was taken by a guy named Joseph of Arimathea, a very prominent Jewish leader, and he was placed in a tomb that belonged to Joseph. So keep in mind, in the Jewish world, a new day always started when the sun went down rather than when the sun went up. And so as the sun went down on Friday afternoon. That started Saturday, which was the Jewish Sabbath. And so according to their own rules, they weren't supposed to visit a grave on the Sabbath. And so as the sun went down on Saturday, Saturday flows into Sunday. It's now very early Sunday morning, sometime before 6 a.m., when a woman named Mary, who was from a little fishing village called Magdala, we call her Mary Magdalene, she decides to visit the tomb. And when she gets there, she sees something that makes no sense to her. If you have your Bible, I want you to look at this with me, verse 1 of John chapter 20. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." One of the things I love about John's gospel, he's a master at using these certain phrases that capture the emotion and the essence behind each of these stories. For example, if you go back to John chapter 1, there's this great passage that we usually read at Christmas in which he talks about how Jesus is the light that invaded our dark world. John 1:5, he says it like this: "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has now not overcome it." But then you get to John 20, and all of a sudden, it looks as if that's been reversed. Because in verse 1 of John 20, he says, "Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark." All of a sudden, it looked as if the darkness had finally overcome the light. But even in the way he writes the phrase, there's a hint of hope, because he says, "while it was still dark," which is a good indication that it won't always be dark. Some of you walked in here this morning on Easter Sunday morning, and you may feel like you're in a dark place. Maybe just like the disciples, you feel as if your world has been upended. Maybe nothing in your life has gone according to your plan. And now all you can do, it's a hard thing to do just to get out of bed and struggle through another day. Maybe your heart is broken, your health is failing, your relationships are strained, your finances are a mess, and when you lay down at night to try to sleep, it takes you forever to go to sleep because of all the anxious thoughts that race through your mind. I think that's exactly where Mary was that morning. For her, and maybe for you, it felt like everything in her world was crumbling around her, and everywhere she looked, it was pretty dark. One of the things I love about this story, though, especially in John 20, is that the resurrection of Jesus, as incredible as it was not the only resurrection that took place that day. So if you're here this morning, and it feels like you need a fresh start, it feels like you need to experience a resurrection, I want you to pay close attention to what happens to Mary Magdalene, because she experiences her own resurrection. So we're calling this a roadmap to a resurrection. There are kind of 3 steps on this road. So if you're tracking with us, here's the first one. If you want to experience a resurrection, you first have to examine the evidence. John tells us that the very first thing that Mary noticed when she arrived at the tomb early on that Sunday morning was that the stone that had been used to seal off the entrance to the tomb had been moved. Now, you got to understand, because of the explosive nature of the situation, like the political environment surrounding Jesus' death, the Jewish leaders had gone to Pilate, who was the Roman governor in charge of that area, and they asked him to take responsibility for making that tomb secure. Matthew, who was an eyewitness to all of these events, said it like this in Matthew 27. He said, "Take a guard," Pilate answered. "Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how." So they went and they made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting a guard. Now the seal that they put on the stone was the Roman seal. It was the official Roman seal that said Rome had taken possession of this, and everybody knew that if you mess with that stone, or if you somehow tried to enter that tomb, you would pay with your life. I mean, all of a sudden, Rome took possession, and there was going to be no messing around. The question then, of course, is why would anybody guard the tomb of a dead person? Well, make sure you understand, it's not because they thought he was coming back to life. One thing that everybody agreed on in the first century and in our time is that once you're dead, man, you're dead. And once you're buried, you're especially dead. So they're not thinking, Jesus is going to come back from the dead. Their thing is they want this to go away. They want to avoid any further drama. They've been through a week, unlike anything they could ever remember. So now they've come to this Sunday, they've come to Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and they're waiting for the news cycle to end so that everybody will start talking about something else. So they post these guards, they put this seal up, and in their mind, that will be the end of the story. Nobody's going to mess with Rome. Nobody's going to mess with this tomb. And that's where Mary comes, and she sees that the stone has been moved. She knows all this, and she thinks, what in the world is going on? So she immediately runs back to Peter, who was kind of the unofficial leader of the disciples, and she tells him what she's seen. And that's when Peter and John, the guy that wrote this, they immediately go back to the tomb, and they want to see it for themselves. So if you have your Bible still open, verse 3. So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. One of the things that can trip you up when you read through John is he never calls himself by name. He always calls himself the disciple that Jesus loved or the other disciple. So when John just casually mentions that the other disciple, meaning him, outran Peter, that's kind of a first century humble brag. You know what I'm saying? It's like, hey, I'm not saying I won, but I didn't lose either, right? He wanted everybody to know that. Then you get to verse 5. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him, and he went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, there he goes again, also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to the place where they were staying. What you see in this first part is all these people involved, all these people, they know what's happened, and they're trying to make sense of what they see. They were there Thursday night when he was arrested. They watched on Friday as he was crucified. They watched him take his last breath. They saw him entombed in Joseph's tomb. And now the body's gone, the tomb's open, and nobody knows what to think. And they look in there and they make a big deal of the grave clothes. It just makes you think this was not grave robbers. I mean, why would somebody unwrap a decomposing body before they stole a corpse? That doesn't make any sense. And then you remember that the grave clothes were probably the most expensive thing inside that tomb. So if somebody was going to take something, that would be the thing they would take. It makes no sense. And so they're looking at this and they don't know what to do. So verse 10 says they go back to where they were staying so that they can continue to process what they've seen. Let me stop there for a second and say, for some of you, that may be where you are. Maybe you spent your whole life hearing this story about the resurrection, and you still don't know whether or not you believe it. And if you do believe it, you're not sure what it has to do with you. Can I just tell you, if you're a little bit skeptical that Jesus came back from the dead, I want you to know you're in good company. Because even the people who were closest to him had a lot more questions than they had answers. And so they continued to process this, and I hope you'll continue to process. And I'm not going to take the time to go through all the historical reasons why we think Jesus came back from the dead, but I do want to mention just two that may be interesting to you. So the first sort of historical piece is the inclusion of women and the testimony of Mary Magdalene herself. One of the things that almost all historians agree on is that if you were going to fabricate a story, especially a story about something as incredible as a resurrection, you would not include the testimony of women unless that's the way it actually happened. And the reason for that is, in the first century, as unfair as it sounds and as unfair as it was, women were not allowed to testify in court because their testimony was often seen as being unreliable. And yet when you read through the gospel narratives about these last week of Jesus' life, as David mentioned earlier in the communion, it was the women who were the last to leave the cross, the first to visit the tomb, as we're going to see later, the first to share the good news of the resurrection. And the only way anybody would include a detail like that is if that's the way it actually happened. One historian, a guy named Andreas Kostenberger, said this: women were the first eyewitnesses of all these things. No one in the ancient world would have posited such eyewitnesses if they had wanted their account to be believed. This fact strongly reinforces the historicity of the events recorded in the Gospels. If you're going to make up a story, you probably wouldn't make up a story like this. The other thing to keep in mind is the change in Jesus' followers. If you were with us a couple weeks ago, we talked about how on Thursday night, when the temple police and the Roman soldiers stormed into that garden, all of Jesus' disciples ran away and hid in fear for their lives. And you kind of get a sense of that even in this passage. You kind of get a sense that they're still scared. And yet after the resurrection, everything changes. Instead of hiding, they're now out in public. Instead of cowering in fear before the political leaders, they begin to challenge those same political leaders. Instead of denying that they even know Jesus, they're out in the streets proclaiming the truth about Jesus. And so when you look at this, you think, what happened to these people? Something happened that changed them. One Japanese historian, a guy named Shusaki Indu. I practiced all week saying that, and I just nailed it, and I feel pretty good. Here's what he wrote. He said, if you don't believe in the resurrection, you will be forced to believe that something hit the disciples that was every bit as amazing, maybe different, yet of equal force in its electrifying intensity. For if we try to explain the changed lives of the early Christians, you will find yourself making leaps of faith as great as if you had believed in the resurrection to start with. Can I just tell you, something happened to these people that changed them. And if you want to experience that same kind of change, you have to be open to the evidence. If you look at this paragraph, there's a word that comes up over and over again, and it's the word saw. So in verse 1, it says, Mary saw that the stone had been removed. Then you get down to verse 6, and it says, Peter saw that the strips of linen were lying there. And then you get to verse 8, and John's talking about himself. It says that the other disciple, he saw the same thing that Peter had seen. Like, he saw the same thing, but there's a different Greek word that's used. And so the NIV translated, he saw and believed. And what that means is he saw the same things they saw, but in his mind, he started to put the pieces together. And verse 9 makes it clear he didn't have a complete understanding, but even in what he saw, he knew there was something that had happened that he couldn't explain and that couldn't be ignored. And I hope you'll admit the same thing. Now, here's the second step on this road to resurrection, and that's when you respond to Jesus' call. At the end of verse 10, it says that Peter and John go back to where they were staying so they can process what they've seen. And then when you get to verse 11, it says Mary goes back to the tomb a second time. And when she does, she has this encounter that changes everything. Verse 11, now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. And they asked her, woman, why are you crying? They have taken my Lord away, she said, and I don't know where they've put him. At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize it was Jesus. And he asked her, woman, why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for? Thinking he was the gardener, she said, sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will get him. Now, a lot of people read this, and they question, why did Mary not immediately recognize Jesus? And there's a lot of different reasons. Maybe it was because of her tears. Maybe it was because it was still dark. Some people think it's because his body looked just different enough that you would have had to take a second look. I mean, you think about the story I told you earlier. If Tyler Chase had immediately gone home and knocked on his mother's front door, The last person on earth she would have ever expected to see would be her son because she thought her son was dead. And I think that's what's happening here. I think the reason Mary didn't recognize Jesus is because she didn't expect to see him. You get down to verse 15, it's clear she's looking for a dead body, not a person that's alive. But then she has this encounter with Jesus in verse 16. Jesus said to her, Mary, and she turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. Jesus said, do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. It's amazing. All it took was Jesus to say her name, and she responded. And from that moment forward, everything for her was different. I told you earlier, there are two resurrections in this passage, and one of them is contingent upon the other one. Because Jesus Christ came back from the dead physically, Mary could come back from the dead spiritually. But what I want you to catch is that as soon as Jesus says her name, she responds. She doesn't hesitate. She doesn't try to overthink it. She just responds. And the way it's written, the indication is that she ran toward Jesus and she immediately wrapped her arms around us, which is why you get that weird thing where Jesus says, hey, you can't hold on to me. Last Sunday night, after our worship night, I went home and I caught the second half of the game between the Houston Cougars and Texas A&M in the tournament. Now, I know, like, once Kentucky gets beat, we try to pretend the tournament's over, but it's still going on. If you saw that game, it was really incredible. With 2 minutes to go, Texas A&M was down 13 points. Everybody thought the game was over, but somehow they went on this incredible run. They cut it to just 3. Now, there's 1.2 seconds on the clock. They're down 3 points. They kick it in. A guy named Anderson Garcia at the top of the key hits this buzzer beater to tie the game. I've got a picture of what happened immediately after this. I wish I could show you the video, because from there, it's Anderson Garcia laying on the floor, just hit this buzzer beater, and then all of his teammates start piling on top of him. And they're all grabbing on and high-fiving. And if you watch the game, this went on for 20 or 30 seconds, and then kind of this weird moment came when all the Texas A&M coaches came out, and they had to pull people up off the floor and separate the guys, and they reminded them, hey, game's not over. Like, we didn't win, we just tied it. And so they had to get in the huddle and prepare for the overtime. And I think that's exactly what Jesus is doing with Mary here. She's ready to celebrate and stay with him. And he's saying, hey, there's still some stuff that I need to do. And there's one thing that he wants her to do. And that brings you to the last thing in this roadmap. And that's when you've had an experience with Jesus, you begin to share the good news of Jesus. The first time we're introduced to Mary is in Luke chapter 8. Luke tells us that Jesus and his little entourage are traveling from village to village, and he casually mentions that there's this little group of women that are traveling with them, of whom Jesus had earlier healed some of them of evil spirits. And guess who's a member of that group? Mary. Luke 8:2 is the first time she's mentioned in Scripture. It says, the 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases, Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Now, in Scripture, the number 7 is the number of completion. So what Luke is indicating there is that Mary was a person whose entire life was consumed with evil. She was completely possessed by demons. So you think about somebody that you've known whose life has spiraled out of control because of addiction or maybe a mental health issue or crime, and then you put all that together, and that's a picture of who Mary was. She was a complete and total train wreck. She couldn't do anything that didn't involve evil. But then you get to the end of John 20, it's a different picture. The last time she's ever mentioned in Scripture is John 20, verse 18. Here's what it says. Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, I have seen the Lord, and she told him that he had said these things to her. Make sure you don't miss this. The first person to ever share the message of the resurrection was not a religious scholar, It was not a Pharisee. It wasn't somebody that memorized all the verses and had the answers to all the questions. Instead, it was a woman, and if that wasn't crazy enough, it was a woman whose life had once been completely consumed with evil. And yet something happened to her. This encounter with Jesus so radically transformed her life, so redirected her life, that she becomes the first person to ever tell other people about him. You know what that tells me? That tells me there is nobody who is so far from God that they can't come home. And there is nobody that God can't use to share the good news. One of the things I love about John's gospel is that he has a way of bookending everything. So you look at even at this chapter, this passage, verse 1, he says, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary went to the tomb. 2 days earlier, she had watched as the one she owed everything to and the one to whom she had pinned all her hopes and dreams had died. And so as she went to that tomb that day, she did not go with a sense of expectation. She went with a sense of grief. On Friday, her world had gotten dark. And in the hours after his crucifixion, it had only gotten darker. But by the end of this verse, by the end of this passage, you get to verse 18, everything looks different. Instead of wandering around in darkness, she's telling everybody that will listen about this thing that has happened and this person who has come back that has changed her life. And the only way you can explain a transformation like that is that she saw something and she encountered someone that for her changed everything. I want to go back to a quote I've shared with you throughout this series from one of my favorite writers, N.T. Wright. Here's what he said. The resurrection completes the inauguration of God's kingdom. It is the decisive event demonstrating that God's kingdom really has been launched on earth as it is in heaven. The message of Easter, don't miss this, the message of Easter is that God's new world has been unveiled in Jesus Christ and that you're now invited to belong to it. And maybe the best part of all this is that invitation is for everybody. No matter what you've done, no matter how far away you've drifted, it's open to you.